At 68, after my divorce, I became homeless. My own daughter laughed. "You're too old, Dad. Nobody needs you anymore." One day, a lawyer approached me. "Sir, your first wife from the 1970s died. She left you a fortune of $47 million. But there's one condition." "Good day, folks. Name's Eugene Theodore Patterson, but most people just call me Gene. I'm 68 years old and I never thought I'd be telling this story to anyone. Never thought the word homeless would apply to a man who worked 40 years as an industrial electrician, raised a family, and believed his daughter would always have his back. But life has a way of teaching you lessons when you least expect them. It was a Tuesday morning in October when my world fell apart. I was sitting in my kitchen on Maple Street in Columbus, Ohio, drinking coffee and reading the sports section like I'd done every morning for 15 years. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of that old wall clock Brenda's mother gave us. That's when Brenda, my second wife, walked in with divorce papers already signed by her lawyer. "I can't do this anymore, Gene," she said, not even looking at me. Just stood there by the kitchen counter, tapping her fingernails on the manila envelope. "I'm 61, I need to think about my future." What she meant was she'd found herself a younger man with more money. A 55-year-old contractor named Phil who drove a new Silverado and promised her things I couldn't provide on my pension. I'd seen the signs for months. The hushed phone calls, the new clothes, the sudden interest in going out with girlfriends on Saturday nights. "Brenda, we can work this out," I said, setting down my coffee cup. The ceramic made a small clink against the saucer, and for some reason, that tiny sound seemed louder than my voice. She shook her head. "Gene, you're a good man, but we both know this hasn't been working for years. Phil and I, we have plans. That was the word that stuck with me. After 13 years of marriage, she had plans that didn't include me. The divorce took 6 months and left me with almost nothing. The house was in both our names, but Brenda's lawyer was sharper than mine, some slick guy in a $1,000 suit who made my public defender look like he'd never seen a divorce case before. I got a small settlement, enough to cover maybe 3 months of rent, my tools, and my pickup truck. That was it. 40 years of steady work, paying into Social Security, saving what I could, and I was left with the contents of my toolbox and a 2018 Ford F-15 with 140,000 miles on it. But the real kick in the gut came from my daughter, Melissa. Melissa Patterson Taylor, 43 years old, works as an accountant for some insurance company downtown. She's my flesh and blood, raised her since she was 3 when her mother died in that car accident on I-71. I worked double shifts for years to put her through Ohio State, walked her down the aisle at her wedding to that worthless husband she finally kicked out, helped her with the down payment on her house in Worthington. When the divorce papers were served, I called her that evening. Figured my daughter would at least listen to my side of the story, maybe offer some support during the worst time of my life. "Dad," she said, her voice flat and businesslike, "maybe this is for the best. You and Brenda haven't been happy for years. Everyone could see it. Honey, I need a place to stay for a few weeks," I told her, standing in what used to be my living room, looking at the boxes I'd packed, just until I figure things out. "I can sleep on your couch, help with Danny's homework, do some repairs around the house." There was a long pause. I could hear the TV in the background. Some reality show she was always watching. Then she said something that still rings in my ears 3 years later. "Dad, you're 68 years old. You had your time. Kyle and I are building our future together, and we can't have you dragging us down. You need to figure this out yourself." Kyle Murphy, that's her boyfriend. Moved in right after she kicked her husband out last year. Real piece of work that one minus never worked a steady job in his life, spends his time playing video games and complaining about how the world owes him something. But he's 35 and drives a motorcycle, and apparently that's what my daughter thinks she needs. I hung up the phone and stood there in the empty house, surrounded by boxes and the echo of my own breathing. By January, I was living in room 127 at the Sunset Motel on East Main Street on the rough side of Columbus. $200 a week for a room that smelled like stale cigarettes and had brown carpet stains I didn't want to think too hard about. The window faced the dumpster, and I could hear every conversation through the paper-thin walls, arguments about money, crying babies, people coming and going at all hours of the night. The heater barely worked, rattling and coughing out lukewarm air that never quite took the chill off. I'd lie on that sagging mattress with its broken spring that poked into my left side, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like the outline of Texas, wondering how a man who'd never been arrested, never cheated on his wife, never missed a day of work in 40 years, ends up in a place like this. I'd sit at the little table by the window some evenings, eating microwave dinners and watching the parking lot fill up with beat-up cars and people who looked as lost as I felt. There was a woman in room 13 who cried every night around 11 p.m., a guy in room 125 who worked night security somewhere and left every evening at 10:30 sharp, always nodding politely when we passed in the breezeway. These weren't bad people. They were just people who'd run out of better options, same as me. That's when the stories started spreading around town. Brenda, settling into my old house with Phil, began telling people at the grocery store and the bank that I was difficult to live with and that I never appreciated what I had. She painted herself as the long-suffering wife who'd finally found the courage to leave. Meanwhile, she moved Phil into our bedroom within a month, and his truck was parked in the driveway where mine used to be. The worst part was when I ran into some old friends at Murphy's Tavern on 5th Street. Jerry Walsh, a guy I'd worked construction with back in the 80s, actually looked uncomfortable when I walked in. They were all sitting at our usual table in the back, but the conversation stopped when they saw me. Jerry said, not quite meeting my eyes, heard about you and Brenda. Shame about that. I ordered a beer and tried to join the conversation, but it felt forced. These guys I'd known for 20 years were treating me like I had something contagious. Finally, Jerry leaned over and said, quiet enough that the others couldn't hear, maybe you should have tried harder to keep Brenda happy, you know? Women her age, they need attention. I finished my Budweiser, left a 5 on the table and walked out. Didn't go back to Murphy's after that. It was on a Wednesday in late February when everything changed. I was sitting in the motel lobby, a cramped space with 2 torn vinyl chairs and a coffee table covered in old magazines, pretending to read a copy of Field and Stream from 2019. The lobby always smelled like pine air freshener, trying to cover up something worse, and the fluorescent light overhead buzzed like an angry wasp. That's when this man in a dark suit walked through the glass door, bringing cold air and the sound of traffic with him. He was maybe 50, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than I made in a week, and he had that careful way about him that screamed lawyer. He approached Dolores at the front desk, a heavy-set woman in her 60s who chain-smoked Marlboro Lights and knew everyone's business. Excuse me, ma'am. I'm looking for a Eugene Patterson. I believe he's staying here. I looked up from the magazine and our eyes met. He was tall, well-groomed, with graying hair and the kind of steady gaze that comes from delivering serious news for a living. Mr. Patterson, my name is Carl Rodriguez. I'm an estate attorney from Portland, Oregon. I've been looking for you for quite some time. We sat down in those cracked plastic chairs, and he set his briefcase carefully on his knees. The lobby suddenly felt too small, too quiet, except for the hum of the Coke machine in the corner and the distant sound of someone's TV through the thin walls. Mr. Patterson, I have some news that's going to be difficult to process. Your first wife, Catherine Louise Patterson, passed away last month in Portland. I stared at him, feeling like someone had just punched me in the chest. Catherine died in 1979, I said slowly. Car accident in Michigan. I went to her funeral. Carl Rodriguez shook his head, and I saw something like sympathy in his eyes. No, sir. Catherine Patterson survived that accident. She left Columbus shortly afterward under circumstances I'll explain in detail. She passed away on January 15th of this year in Portland, Oregon. The magazine slipped from my hands and hit the coffee table with a soft thud. She left an estate valued at approximately $47 million, and you, Mr. Patterson, are named as the primary beneficiary. I felt the room spin slightly, like when you stand up too fast after sitting for a long time. $47 million. The number was so big it didn't even register properly in my brain. There is one condition, Carl added quietly. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there on that rattling mattress in room 127, staring at the Texas-shaped water stain on the ceiling, trying to piece together what Carl Rodriguez had told me over coffee at the Waffle House down the street. Catherine, my Kathy, the girl with the strawberry blonde hair and the laugh that could light up a room. We'd met at a union dance in 1975, both of us 25 years old and thinking we had the world figured out. She worked at the bank downtown. I was pulling wire at the new mall they were building on the north side. We got married in a little church ceremony with maybe 30 people, honeymooned at Lake Erie because it was all we could afford. We had 4 good years together before that accident, or what I thought was an accident. She was in that wreck. Carl had explained, stirring sugar into his coffee with slow, deliberate motions. But she survived. The problem was Catherine had gotten herself into some trouble, financial trouble. She'd borrowed money from some people who weren't patient about collecting, and she was scared. Terrified, actually. Turns out, my sweet Kathy had been trying to help her brother Danny get out of gambling debt. Danny was always a screw-up, always needing money for one scheme or another. This time, he owed 15 grand to some loan sharks who were making threats about broken legs and worse. Kathy took out a second mortgage on our little house without telling me, tried to play the stock market to make quick money, lost it all. By the time she realized how deep she was in, the people Danny owed were coming around asking questions about his family. She was 29 years old and over her head, and she thought disappearing was the only way to protect you, Carl said. She staged her own death after the accident, let everyone assume she died, and left town. Instead of telling me, instead of trusting that we could figure it out together, she chose to let me grieve her for 45 years. Catherine had rebuilt her life in Oregon under a slight variation of her name, going by Kate Patterson in business dealings. She started small, cleaning office buildings at night, saving every penny. Eventually, she got her real estate license, made some smart investments in Portland when the market was just starting to boom. Bought rundown houses, fixed them up, sold them for profit. Carl showed me a photo from her personal effects. She'd kept our wedding picture for all these years, tucked inside her jewelry box. Both of us young and grinning at the camera, thinking love was enough to handle anything life threw at us. The condition of the inheritance was this. Because Catherine had legally died without a death certificate being issued in 1979, and because of the legal complications of her disappearance, I'd have to prove my identity as her original husband and go through a probate hearing in Portland within 60 days. "I'll do it," I said without hesitation. Carl arranged everything that would be covered by the estate, flight to Portland, hotel accommodation, legal fees. All I had to do was gather up what documents I still had from our marriage. Thankfully, I'm the kind of guy who keeps everything in file folders even after all these years. Our marriage certificate, photos from the wedding, and our short honeymoon, letters she wrote me when I was doing electrical work on that hospital project in Toledo and had to stay in a motel for 3 weeks. When I called Melissa to tell her I was going out of town on business, she barely listened. I could hear Kyle in the background playing some video game, the electronic sounds of gunfire and explosions competing with my voice. "Whatever, Dad. Just don't expect me to bail you out if you get in trouble. Kyle and I have our own problems right now." She hung up before I could explain what kind of business trip it was. Portland was different than I expected. Clean streets, coffee shops on every corner, people riding bicycles in February. My hotel room was on the 4th floor of a place called the Riverview Inn, and it actually did have a view of the Willamette River. The room was warm, the bed was firm, and for the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking up to hear my neighbors arguing through the walls. The probate attorney Carl connected me with was a sharp woman named Susan Palmer. Her office was in a glass building downtown, with a view of Mount Hood on clear days. She went through my documents with the precision of someone who'd handled complex estate cases before. Everything checked out perfectly. The marriage certificate dated March 18, 1975, the photos from our wedding at St. Mark's Lutheran Church, even the handwriting on Kathy's old letters matched samples from her personal papers that had been part of the estate inventory. That's when Susan Palmer told me about the complications. "Mr. Patterson, I need to inform you that Mrs. Patterson had a business partner in her later years. A woman named Linda Campbell. She was not named in the will, but she's filed a formal contest of the probate. She claims she was Catherine's domestic partner and deserves a portion of the estate." Linda Campbell, 51 years old, lived in Seattle. She'd been informed about the estate and about me 2 weeks before Carl found me at the Sunset Motel, which meant she'd had plenty of time to plan her strategy. The call came 3 days later while I was having breakfast at a small diner near my hotel. My cell phone buzzed with an unknown number, minus Seattle area code. "Is this Eugene Patterson? Speaking, my name is Linda Campbell. I think we need to talk." She wanted to meet at some upscale restaurant in downtown Portland called Harbor View. The kind of place with cloth napkins and a wine list, where a hamburger costs $20. When I got there, she was already seated at a corner table dressed in a navy blue blazer and looking like she meant business. She had a younger guy with her, maybe 35, who she introduced as her boyfriend Marcus. He didn't say much throughout the meal, just sat there with the particular alertness of someone ready to be useful in ways I probably wouldn't like. Linda got straight to the point. "You were married to Catherine for 4 years, 45 years ago. I lived with her, took care of her in her final years, managed her business affairs and her personal needs. That must have meant a lot to her," I said carefully, cutting into my overpriced salmon. "It did. We were partners in every sense of the word for 8 years, which is why I'm having trouble understanding why she left me nothing. Not the house we shared, not the business accounts I helped manage. Everything to you, a man she hadn't seen in half a century." I could see where this conversation was heading, but I let her talk. "I think you should consider a voluntary settlement," she continued, leaning forward slightly, "before this becomes something difficult and expensive for everyone involved." She named her price, $15 million to me, $32 million to her, in exchange for me stepping back from the probate process entirely. "Let the estate fall into default," she explained, where she could bring her own claim as a longtime domestic partner and caregiver. I looked at her for a long moment, thinking about room 127 at the Sunset Motel, about Melissa hanging up on me, about eating microwave dinners by myself while watching the parking lot fill up with other broken down people. "I'll need to think about it," I said. I had no intention of thinking about it, but I needed to know what she'd do next when I said no. I found out that evening when I got back to my hotel. Someone had been through my room. Nothing was taken. My documents were locked in Susan Palmer's office, safe minus, but things had been moved around. I'm an electrician. After 40 years of installing security systems and troubleshooting electrical problems, I notice when things aren't where I left them. The lamp by the bed was turned slightly. My shaving kit had been moved about 2 inches to the left on the bathroom counter. Small things, but enough to tell me that someone with skills had conducted a professional search. I called Susan Palmer immediately, then the hotel manager. The manager was a nervous guy named Ted, who pulled up the electronic keycard records on his computer. Someone had entered my room during a 90-minute window that afternoon using a master key card. We'll look into this immediately, Mr. Patterson, Ted said, adjusting his glasses. This is completely unacceptable. But we both knew that by the time hotel security reviewed the hallway cameras, whoever had done this would be long gone. Susan Palmer took the break-in seriously. By the next morning, she'd moved me to a smaller, less conspicuous hotel across town and connected me with a litigation specialist named Paul Gibson who handled contested probate cases. Mr. Patterson, Paul said over coffee in his office, Ms. Campbell isn't going to accept your inheritance quietly. The room search tells me she's prepared to play hardball. He was right. 3 days later, Linda filed a formal contest of the probate, claiming that Catherine had suffered from dementia in her final years, that I'd somehow exerted undue influence from 2,000 miles away without knowing she was alive, and that Catherine's true intention had been to provide for her longtime domestic partner. Then she escalated in a way I never saw coming. My grandson Danny called me from Columbus. He's 19, a good kid who's always been caught in the middle of his mother's drama, but somehow managed to stay decent despite everything. Grandpa, something weird happened today. This guy came to Mom's house asking questions about you. Wanted to know if you drink too much, if you've ever been in trouble with the law, if you're good with money. I felt my stomach drop. What kind of guy, Danny? Well-dressed, real polite, had a business card and everything, said he was doing background research for some legal case. Mom invited him in and talked to him for like an hour. That's when I realized Melissa was involved. Danny's always been straight with me, even when his mother tried to turn him against me after the divorce. He told me Melissa had been in contact with Linda Campbell's attorney, providing what she called character references about my mental state and my fitness to manage a large estate. My own daughter was actively helping a stranger try to steal my inheritance. The betrayal hit me harder than Brenda's divorce, harder than losing the house, harder than ending up in that motel room. This was my flesh and blood. The little girl I'd raised from the time she was 3 years old, the kid I'd worked double shifts to put through college, actively working against me for money she had no legal claim to. But I'm not the kind of man who goes down without a fight, especially when the fight comes to me. I started documenting everything. Paul Gibson helped me understand what was legal and what wasn't. I recorded phone calls when Ohio law allowed it, kept detailed notes of every conversation, every threat, every attempt at intimidation. I also hired a private investigator, a retired cop named Mike Santos who specialized in background checks and asset investigation. What Mike found over the next 2 weeks was very interesting. Melissa had been lying to me about her financial situation. She wasn't just struggling, she was drowning. Gambling debts, credit cards maxed out behind on her mortgage. Kyle had been pressuring her to find money somewhere, anywhere, and when she heard about my potential inheritance through Linda Campbell's attorney, she saw an opportunity. She'd made a deal. Help contest the probate by providing damaging testimony about my character and mental capacity, and Linda would cut her in for 20% of whatever she recovered. $4 million if they could get me declared unfit to inherit. The hearing was scheduled for late March in the Multnomah County Courthouse in Portland. Paul Gibson and I flew back with a thick folder of evidence and a strategy that he assured me was both legal and effective. The courthouse was an imposing brick building downtown, with marble floors that echoed with every footstep and the kind of formal atmosphere that makes you whisper even when you don't need to. We sat at the petitioner's table in a wood-paneled courtroom that smelled like old books and floor wax. Linda Campbell sat across from us with her attorney, Gregory Bell, a slick guy in an expensive suit who looked like he charged by the minute. Marcus was in the gallery behind them, along with a woman I didn't recognize who turned out to be a handwriting expert they'd hired. The hearing started with the basics. Paul presented our case methodically: the marriage certificate, the photos, the letters Catherine had written me during our marriage. Catherine's doctor testified via video conference that she'd been mentally sharp and legally competent right up until the cancer took her in January. Then Gregory Bell presented Linda's case. She took the stand and gave emotional testimony about Catherine's supposedly declining mental state, describing confusion and memory lapses that she claimed had gotten worse in Catherine's final years. She painted a picture of an old woman who'd lost touch with reality and was living in the past. But here's where it got interesting. Bell submitted a letter supposedly written by Catherine just 6 months before her death. expressing doubts about her will and her intention to leave everything to a man I haven't seen in 45 years. Paul requested time to examine the letter. The judge granted it, and Paul spent several minutes reading it carefully, comparing it to samples of Catherine's handwriting from her business records. Then Paul approached the bench with a request that changed everything. "Your Honor, I'd like to request that this exhibit be submitted for professional forensic document examination before being admitted as evidence. The handwriting shows several characteristics that appear inconsistent with authenticated samples of Mrs. Patterson's writing from the same general time period." Bell objected, but Judge Morrison overruled him and ordered the letter held pending examination. I watched Linda Campbell's face across the courtroom. Her composure cracked just slightly, a tightening around the jaw, a quick glance at Marcus in the gallery that said something had gone wrong with their plan. The forensic document examination took 11 days. When the report came back, it was 3 pages of technical language that boiled down to one devastating conclusion. The letter was not consistent with Catherine Patterson's handwriting patterns across 14 authenticated reference samples. More damning, the ink composition dated its creation to within the previous 8 months. Catherine had been dead for 14 months. The letter was a forgery. Gregory Bell withdrew from Linda Campbell's case within 48 hours of the forensic report being delivered. In the legal world, attorney withdrawal in the middle of active litigation sends a clear message about what the lawyer believes regarding his client's conduct. Linda tried to find new representation. 3 attorneys declined her case in sequence. Paul told me this wasn't uncommon when central evidence had been proven fraudulent. The hearing reconvened 3 weeks later. Linda appeared alone at the defendant's table, looking smaller somehow than she had at that expensive restaurant where she'd tried to buy me off. Her last attorney had withdrawn just 4 days prior, citing irreconcilable differences regarding case strategy. Judge Morrison didn't take long to deliberate. The estate's legal standing was clear, the documentation was thorough, and the only challenge to my inheritance had been built on forged evidence. He ruled in my favor. The estate of Catherine Louise Patterson, valued at $47 million, passed to Eugene Theodore Patterson as the lawful beneficiary, according to her explicit wishes. I signed the final documents in Paul Gibson's office that afternoon. My hand was steady, but the story doesn't end with a legal victory. The consequences for Linda Campbell unfolded over the following months with the methodical patience of systems that don't hurry but always arrive. Submitting forged documents in probate proceedings is a felony in Oregon. The district attorney's office opened a criminal investigation. Linda was eventually charged, convicted, and sentenced to 8 months in county jail plus substantial fines that wiped out her savings. Marcus disappeared from her life around the time the criminal charges were filed. When I got back to Columbus, Melissa was waiting for me at the airport. Not to congratulate me, not to apologize for helping strangers try to steal from me, but to demand what she felt was rightfully hers. "You can't just keep it all, Dad," she said, following me through the terminal with her voice getting louder. "I'm your daughter. I deserve something after everything I've been through." I stopped walking near the baggage claim and turned to face her. People were staring, but I didn't care anymore. "You deserve exactly what you gave me when I needed you most," I said quietly. "Nothing. But Dad, Kyle and I are in real financial trouble. I was just trying to protect our family's interests. You helped strangers try to steal from me. You told lies about me to investigators. You chose money over family." She started crying then, right there in the airport, making a scene like she used to do when she was 8 years old and didn't get her way. She said Kyle had pressured her, that she was scared about losing the house, that she never meant for things to go so far. "Melissa," I said, picking up my suitcase, "I raised you better than this. I'm disappointed in who you've become." I walked away and didn't look back. As for me, I bought a house outside Portland, nothing too fancy but with a workshop where I can work on electrical projects and a back porch that looks out at mountains that remind me every morning that life isn't over at 70. The house has good bones, solid wiring, and room for a vegetable garden that actually produces tomatoes worth eating. Danny visits sometimes. Turned out Melissa's gambling problems got worse after she lost her shot at my inheritance money. She lost custody when the debts piled up and Kyle left her for someone with better financial prospects. Danny's living with his father now, working part-time at a garage and going to community college. I help him with tuition and car repairs, and he helps me understand why anyone needs a smartphone with 47 different functions. Melissa tried to reconcile about a year later, called me up on a Sunday evening, said she was sorry, asked if we could start over and be a family again. "I forgive you," I told her, and I meant it. But forgiveness doesn't mean I forget what you're capable of when things get hard. You showed me who you really are. Brenda's doing fine, I hear. Phil left her for a woman 10 years younger, and she's back to working part-time at the hospital. We run into each other sometimes at the grocery store when I'm visiting Danny. We nod politely and move on with our lives. The funny thing is, I'm happier now at 70 than I've been in years. I volunteer at the local community college teaching electrical safety to kids getting into the trades. Joined a men's group at the community center where we work on woodworking projects and solve the world's problems over coffee and donuts. I learned something important through all this. You can't control how people treat you, but you can control how you respond. You can't make your family love you, but you can choose who gets to be part of your life going forward. Every morning I wake up in a house I own, surrounded by things I chose, living a life nobody else gets to dictate. That inheritance wasn't just money, it was freedom. Freedom from people who saw me as a burden instead of a blessing. Catherine gave me 2 gifts across 45 years. First, she loved me when we were young and thought we could handle anything. Then, after a lifetime of regret, she gave me the chance to live my remaining years with dignity and purpose. Some evenings I sit on that back porch, looking at those mountains, thinking about how a man can lose everything, his marriage, his home, even his family's respect, and still come out ahead if he keeps his character intact. That's the most important lesson. You can take away a man's house, his marriage, even his children's love, but you can't take his character unless he gives it away himself. I'm Eugene Patterson. I'm 70 years old. I worked honest for 40 years, raised my daughter the best I could, and when the world tried to break me down, I stood back up. At this point in my life, that's enough. That's everything. Sometimes the people who hurt you the most teach you the most valuable lesson, that your worth doesn't depend on their approval and your character is the only thing they can never take away from you. Real wealth isn't just money in the bank, it's waking up every day knowing you kept your integrity when the world tried to break you and choosing dignity over revenge every single time.